wanted to, we had dinner yesterday. Where's Rod? Is Rod here yet? No. He kind of gave the history of SSF, and it was kind of amazing. It was amazing to see just how this place could not have been, and then it took some visionaries 20 years ago to make a commitment to education, and ever since then, the whole globe, I think, the country and the globe has benefited from what they're doing here at Cedars Sinai. So I wanted to thank all our course directors, Johnson, Danielle, and Rod for inviting me over here. I'm giving you all an update of what I talked about a couple years back. So we have made some advancements in the best practices. Today, you'll hear about a lot of different robots. My talk is more, we have robots at Cedars, and this is how we're successfully utilizing it, getting through the learning curve and continuing to be safe and effective with the technology. These are my disclosures, mostly educational. So as I said, 2 years ago, we came and I presented our Cedars Sinai robotic experience. And I think the biggest thing is that it wasn't a completely error-free experience. 2.2% robotic-related complications of 268 patients that we looked at. And these complications, primarily hardware, nerve root injuries, durotomies, reoperations. It wasn't this, and compared to the published literature, which was like 0 or 0.5%, we just weren't seeing that. These were some of the examples we published on, screws phase shifting, reference frames moving, being too far away from the reference frame, after image post-capture, spine dynamization or movement causing lack of accuracy. And what we found, which I think is the same challenge at many other academic institutions or spine centers elsewhere, is that there's a lot of people using the robot, and everyone's got their own kind of workflow. We have 16 spine surgeons at Cedars, ortho and neuro represented, and there's great heterogeneity with robotic usage, workflow, and application. And so what you're going to see is if you have variable outcomes, or when you have variable workflows, you're going to have variable outcomes and ultimately inaccuracies in clinical revisions. And at some point at that time, Dave Skaggs had just joined our group, and he was just like, something's got to be done because this is only heading worse. So the problem, variability, the answer, standardized guidelines and best practices. The idea is to insert as many Swiss cheese slices to prevent that never event of some kind of clinical revision. So how did we do it? We met with more or less every robotic spine surgeon user at Cedars. We asked them in a very kind of hive experience, what are your best practices? What are your tips? What are your tricks? What do you think is important? And we introduced these, we put it all together, and we came out with guidelines that we implemented. I think the biggest pillars of these of our guidelines was it was based off our retrospective review of our institution. So every institution is going to have their own kind of problems. I think the key is to really know when the errors or what your errors were specific to your center in order to build a guideline. We had all stakeholders responsible, not just the surgeon, but the fellows, the trainees, the OR staff, the device reps, even the radiology techs, neuromonitoring. Everyone was involved, and it all felt like a team. There were certain stop points that could be mandatorily agreed by the entire group to truly prevent error, and we'll get into that. And it was a focus on all the different important things, like how you use the robot, how the reference frame is placed, the communication, and even making sure to still use modalities to confirm accuracy. And I think from a systems-based approach, it was not dependent on the surgeon to enforce this. We had our robotic specialists that kept surgeons honest to the things that we were trying to make sure happened. And so, as you know, if it's surgeon-based, there's a sort of drift effect where they eventually don't follow things or they want to speed things up. But these are two robotic reps from both Globus and Mazor were always in a militant kind of fashion, making sure that these guidelines were being implemented. So the guidelines go extensive, but the kind of hallmarks are about 10 major hallmarks, which I'll try to gloss through a little bit. For instance, one of our errors was a Mazor percutaneous pin on the PSIS open, and they were using that stabilization to go march all the way up to T9. If you actually read the Mazor platform guidelines, they say that in an open procedure, if you're using a shank screw pin, L4 to S2, that's it for an open case. And that's weird because we're like, wait, that doesn't make sense. But it was just going back to what they were telling us the robot's limitations were and trying not to push it too much. Other things that were part of that. The second part was you'd be surprised at how many attendings were in the coffee break area while the spin was happening, while the screws were being planned by the fellow and the robotic expert. And we were like, no, the attending has to be there, communication, got to coordinate, and the responsibility, because there's a lot of subtleties that we as attendings know about these trajectories that a trainee may not. Anatomic confirmation. This high-speed drill bit thing, we were kind of in partnership with the guys at Columbia. And what it was is basically, you have this high-speed drill bit for any robot to pierce the cortical bone, 75,000 RPMs. And a lot of our injuries may have happened from navigation accuracy in the drill going into the canal. So when we looked at anatomic morphologic data on the anatomy of the spine, we realized in the thoracic spine there's a certain length before you hit the canal, and in the lumbar spine a certain length as well. And so with those numbers, we said for the thoracic spine, the high-speed drill bit is more to puncture the cortical bone and go no further than 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters to avoid that. And then let that lower speed tap kind of find the pedicle and potentially create less damage. Check the screws with a ball probe. Use our neuromonitoring and our post-op. You'd be surprised at how many attendings were just trusting blindly the robot, not getting a post-op x-ray before they left the room, not getting a post-op spin for some. So we kind of made that a mandatory stop, that the nurses made sure that things were happening before the patient left. And there were other things like reference frames. One of our errors was the surveillance pin on the Globus was not being used anymore by a surgeon, trying to reduce that skin incision, cut time, and it ended up being a reference frame bump that wasn't detected and led to an errant screw. So we kind of incorporated that in. And then I think the biggest thing for us, learning curve-wise, was in the thoracic spine, especially with the Mazor. We were having the reference frame on the robot, and that reference frame doesn't move if the patient moves, and especially when the arm is stretching way high up and there's some variability. We decided that in the thoracic spine, we're getting rid of that robotic reference frame, putting it on the patient, so patient-specific reference frames. And so we employed all these things. And, how did we do? We had the 264 historical controls. We had 290 cases post-guidelines. We collected all their data, looking at primary outcomes of robotic-related complications. The groups were pretty much the same. The post-protocols, they were slightly more in terms of smoking, which is odd in LA. And our primary outcomes were 0% robot-related complication or reoperation since 7/1/2023. And the reality is this number still persists, and we're churning robotic cases. We did have one recently, a couple months ago. It was a trauma case, a 3-column injury on an Enk's spondy, and I think that was more a the robot was used, but there were some issues going on there. And so that's one that I've known of since 2023 where we had a clinical revision. But otherwise, this was accepted at JBJS. And when we look at kind of where we were and where we are now, I think we've made a institutional and material difference for patient safety. So at the end of the day, robotic assisted instrumentation delivery is generally safe, as we all know. That's why we're all here. But there are these kind of blips of clinical inaccuracies, and especially when you start, you yourself may be great, but when you start deploying this technology across your institution, you got to have some form of guideline to maintain patient safety. Every center of excellence that uses the robot, I recommend that you critically look at your data. Every institution is going to be specific, so it's an opportunity for you to really kind of understand where your pain points are. And it really does require, it was kind of nice. It was a collaboration of 16 competitive surgeons all, always fighting against each other to get them all together as one. And it was successful at our institution, so. I wanted to thank Dave Skaggs, Johnson, and the rest of the spine surgery crew, our researchers, and Ahi, who's here, Sean Jenkins, who's here, Dave Baird. They were all those were the policemen making sure that these guidelines were implemented, and it definitely took a village. So thank you so much. Okay, what's our next talk?
That's great. Dr. Kim.
Yeah. Sorry. A little time for questions. I thought it was just going to be a couple and then QA.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic example of quality improvement. And I'm not sure if this is going for the live demo.
Can you get up on mic?
Just a great example of quality improvement. And in terms of, is this applying now for the cervical spine as well? Have you got the same kind of quality rates in cervical spine, or is this just thoracic and lumbar?
Just from my own experience, and we're not using a tremendous amount of robots in the cervical spine. Yeah. And I think that's what's great about this program is we'll see others talking about it. I use it for C7 pedicle screws. Don't use them for, I don't do a lot of cervical pedicle screws. So we haven't really, that area was a little bit less defined, so we didn't include that in the guidelines.
And then this restriction of being within 2 segments of the frame.
Yes.
So how many spins are you doing in a routine, like say a T10 to pelvis? How many spins do you need to do both for guidance as well as to check if you check your screws afterwards?
Yeah, no, that was a great point, is like when we saw that, and with NAV, everyone who uses NAV, it's all about trying to get as many levels as you can with one spin. And you're seeing the manufacturer saying, with one bone mount, it's, 2 levels. With the double bone mount, it's, 3 or 4 outside. It made us realize that we need to go over to the the pre-op CT and the fluoro matching, because that's different. That whole manufacturing recommendation is you can go wide. And so we changed our whole protocol. We used to be spin, 2 or 3 for a T10, 4 or 5 for a T2. It was a little cumbersome, but and what it made us realize is you can't do scan and plan with the robot for big deformities. We switched to the CT fluoro match pathway, which allowed you to be able to get it farther out.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Dr. Kim,
Yes.
as usual, a great lecture, and congratulations on putting us together. That it's kind of established, a whole new realm of safety, which Sig pointed out, is that it's changed what we do. But I mean, when it comes down to your personal practice, I mean, is there kind of a lean one direction or the other of deformity or degenerative cases that you will do with navigation or you do with robotics? I mean, kind of a simple question, but not an easy one.
No, that's a great one. We actually looked at our data. We were doing a lot more T2, T10s in the beginning with the robot, because I think that's where it was. Everyone just didn't know where to put it, and but when we saw the post group, definitely a lot more degen, perk. I think that's where the sweet spot of these robots are just smaller cases. I mean, we still use them for bigger, but when you look historically, the robot is being used less and less for deformity and more, I would say, for MIS open.